She pressed herself back against the cold floor-to-ceiling glass, 37 stories above Bay Street, trembling as Adriano's hand reached toward her. "Don't!" Rue breathed, and the word came out so small she wasn't sure he heard it. His hand stopped in mid-air. His dark eyes dropped to her collar. The oversized blazer had slipped when she flinched, and the bruise was right there, a deep, wine-colored smear across the soft skin of her throat. The office around them seemed to contract. His voice, when it came, was perfectly calm, perfectly measured, and somehow far more frightening than a shout. "Then tell me who put those there." Rue Sinclair had spent 3 years at Ferrara Group learning to be invisible. It was not a difficult skill to master, particularly when you were the sort of woman the Bay Street world was designed to overlook. She was 28, plus size in a world of women who looked like they survived on espresso and ambition, partial to loose blazers in navy and grey that she found at Value Village and wore until the elbows thinned. She had a round face, warm brown skin, and coils of dark natural hair she kept pinned under a clip that was losing its grip by noon most days. She occupied a corner desk on the 22nd floor of the Ferrara Tower, and in 3 years, exactly 4 people had learned her last name. But Rue had a mind that the building's lawyers would have paid anything for if they'd known it existed. She remembered everything, not in the vague, approximate way most people meant when they said that. She meant everything. The specific clause on page 312 of a land acquisition document, the routing number on a wire transfer confirmation she'd processed 18 months ago, the name of a numbered corporation buried in a footnote in a secondary filing from a deal that had closed before she'd even joined the firm. She didn't talk about it. She'd learned early that people found it unsettling, and Rue had enough reasons to be overlooked without adding another one. It was a grey Thursday afternoon in October, Lake Ontario steel-coloured and restless beyond the tower windows, when she found the discrepancy. She was reviewing a land acquisition file for a development site in Etobicoke, a former industrial lot that Ferrara Group was converting into condominiums, the kind of project that had consumed half of Toronto's waterfront and all of its affordable housing stock. The contracts were dense, 412 pages of legal language that would have taken a normal paralegal 2 weeks to process. Rue had been at it since 7 in the morning. On page 312, in a sub-clause nested inside a Schedule C attached to an addendum, she found a $5.8 million consulting fee payable to a numbered company, 1-94627 Ontario Limited. She cross-referenced it in her memory without meaning to, the way she cross-referenced everything. She'd seen that number before, and before that. The same corporation appeared in 3 separate files she'd processed over the past 14 months. Each time the same routing ID, each time the same Cayman Islands correspondent bank. Each time the fee was described differently, consulting, procurement, advisory, but the number never changed. Someone was stealing from Adriano Ferrara, and they were doing it through contracts that passed across her desk. Her hands were not quite steady when she printed the relevant pages and gathered them into a folder. She took them to Blaine Hartwell. Blaine was the senior director of legal affairs, her direct supervisor, the man who had interviewed her, who signed off on her performance reviews, who had once told her in a quarterly check-in that she was a quiet asset to the team. He was tall and angular, with the kind of face that photographed well, and held very little behind it. She found him in the underground parkade on level P2, leaning against a black Audi, jacket off, phone pressed to his ear. When she approached, clutching the folder to her chest, he ended the call and turned to her with the patient, slightly condescending expression he reserved for requests he found tedious. She told him what she'd found. She laid it out methodically, the way she did everything. The file numbers, the corporation, the routing ID, the pattern across 14 months and 3 separate deals. She expected him to go quiet with the particular alertness of a lawyer realizing something serious had been missed. She expected him to reach for the folder. She expected concern, or at least the performance of it. She did not expect his face to go white. And then she did not expect his hand. He moved fast, faster than a man in dress shoes on concrete should have been able to move, and his fingers closed around the front of her blazer and the scarf beneath it, and he shoved her backward into a concrete support pillar. The impact knocked the air out of her. The folder hit the floor and scattered. "Listen to me very carefully." His voice was a hiss, low and close, his breath coming hard against her face. "You didn't find anything. You're going to go back upstairs and delete whatever notes you made, and if I ever hear you mention 111-4627 again, I will make sure they find you floating face down in the harbor. Do you understand me? Do you understand me?" Rue nodded. She could barely breathe. His knuckles were pressed into her collarbone and his grip was vicious, the kind that came from real panic, from someone with something enormous to lose. When he finally let go and shoved her sideways, she went down on one knee on the filthy concrete. She heard his car door slam, heard the tires shriek up the ramp. She gathered the scattered pages with shaking hands. She took the elevator back to the 22nd floor. She sat at her desk for exactly 4 minutes, looking at her computer screen without seeing it. Then she packed her bag, walked out, and took the streetcar home to Leslieville. Her apartment was small and warm and full of books, and she stood in the washroom for a long time, looking at the bruise already forming across her collarbone, a deep reddish purple that would deepen to wine and black overnight, shaped unmistakably like fingers. She was a soft woman, and the marks stood out against her skin in a way that made her feel utterly helpless. She thought about the harbor comment. She thought about the routing number she still had memorized, every digit of it, because she couldn't forget things even when she desperately wanted to. She decided she would quit. She would send her resignation in the morning, take her savings, go stay with her cousin in Halifax until all of this went somewhere else. But Adriano Ferrara did not let things simply go somewhere else. She was reaching for her laptop the next morning, still in her dressing gown, when someone knocked on her door. Not the way neighbors knocked, 3 measured, unhurried raps that communicated patience and inevitability in equal measure. She opened it to 2 men in perfectly tailored suits. One of them smiled with practiced pleasantness. "Mrs. Sinclair, Mr. Ferrara would like a word." It was not a request. She dressed in 10 minutes and said nothing in the car. The drive up Bay Street felt like being carried somewhere against gravity. The Ferrara Group Tower had a lobby full of Italian marble and the particular silence of places where very large amounts of money changed hands quietly and often. She was taken past the 22nd floor in an elevator she had never been permitted to access before, all the way up to the penthouse level. The doors opened directly into an office unlike anything she'd seen in the building below. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides. The entire Toronto skyline laid out like a map. The CN Tower to the southwest, Lake Ontario a flat grey line beyond it, the islands just visible through October haze. The desk was a single slab of dark walnut, uncluttered. The bookshelves behind it held what appeared to be actual books, red ones, spines cracked and pages marked. And behind the desk sat Adriano Ferrara. She had seen him before, twice in passing, the way you see a man in a building you both inhabit, but she had never been in a room with him. He was somewhere in his late 30s, dark-haired, the kind of face that was all precision and no softness, built broad through the shoulders in a way his suit didn't quite obscure. He wore no tie. There was ink at his left wrist, just visible below the cuff. He was looking at her with the focused stillness of a man who had learned to read people quickly, and rarely needed to be told anything twice. "Sit down, Rue." He used her first name. He said it like he'd been saying it for years. She sat in the low leather chair across from him and pulled her blazer tighter around her shoulders, instinctively hiding the scarf she'd wrapped around her throat. She fixed her eyes on the corner of his desk. "I run internal audits on all document access," Adriano said, cross-referenced against flagged file numbers. "Yours triggered one yesterday. You spent 11 hours on a file that should have taken 3. He leaned back, fingers steepled. You found the discrepancy in the Etobicoke acquisition. Rue swallowed. Yes. And you took it to Blaine Hartwell. The name landed in the quiet room like a stone dropped in still water. Her voice came out very small. He's my direct supervisor. It was protocol. Adriano stood. He moved the way large men sometimes did, with a kind of deliberate economy, as if every motion were chosen rather than automatic. He came around the desk, and when he stopped beside her chair and crouched down, deliberately lowering himself to her eye level so he wasn't looming over her, she noticed the small thing of it, the awareness it took. He reached toward her, one hand, intending to tip her chin up gently to make her look at him. She flinched. She couldn't stop it. The motion was too much like another hand in a parking garage. She pressed back against the arm of the chair, one hand coming up, and the blazer slipped from her shoulder, and the scarf shifted with it, and the bruise was right there in the October light flooding through the floor-to-ceiling glass, deep purple, shaped like a hand, sitting across the soft skin of her throat like a signature. Adriano went absolutely still. Don't, she had breathed, not even meaning to say it aloud. His hand stopped mid-air, and then his voice came, very quiet, stripped of everything except the thing underneath. Then tell me who put those there. A tear ran down her cheek before she could stop it. She pressed her lips together and forced herself to keep her eyes open. Blaine, she said. In the parkade last night, he told me to forget what I'd found. He said they'd find me in the harbor if I didn't. The silence that followed was not empty. It had weight to it. Temperature. Adriano rose to his full height and walked to the window, his back to her, his reflection in the glass showing her an expression she did not have a word for. Cosimo, he said without turning, without raising his voice. A door she hadn't noticed opened, and a large man with a scarred jaw stepped into the room. Find Blaine Hartwell, wherever he is. Bring him to the warehouse. A pause, precise as a full stop. Don't tell him why. Cosimo was gone before Rue could process that the sentence had ended. Adriano turned back. Something in his face had reorganized, not softer exactly, but directed differently. He looked at her the way someone looks at something they've just realized they very nearly lost. You can't go back to your apartment, he said. If Blaine made the contact I think he made, there are people who know your name by now. He picked up his phone and said 4 words into it she didn't catch, and within 20 minutes Rue was in the back of a black SUV with tinted windows, the Toronto skyline contracting behind them as they moved north through the early evening traffic toward Yorkville. Adriano sat beside her. He said almost nothing, but he sat close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and she found in some dim and reluctant way that it helped. The penthouse was in a discreet building on Hazelton Avenue, the kind of address that required a code for the elevator and a second code for the private entrance, and the interior was nothing like the formal office. This was a home. Dark leather and pale oak, walls of glass overlooking the bare autumn trees of the neighborhood below, art that had been chosen by someone who actually looked at things. A kitchen that smelled faintly of garlic and old coffee. 5 people know this address, Adriano said, shrugging his jacket off and folding back the cuffs of his shirt. The ink at his wrist extended further than she'd realized. A botanical pattern that climbed the inside of his forearm. You're the 5th. He disappeared briefly and returned with a medical kit of the thorough professional variety that suggested it had seen use before. He sat beside her on the sofa and left a full cushion's width between them, the small courtesy of it not lost on her. May I? He gestured at her shoulder. Rue hesitated just long enough to feel foolish, and then nodded and let the blazer slip. She heard him draw a slow, controlled breath when he saw the full extent of the bruising in the warm light of the penthouse. His jaw tightened, but his hands, when they moved to apply the cooling gel, were extraordinarily careful. A deliberate feather-light touch that was nothing like what had left the marks. She felt the cold of the arnica and the warmth underneath it, and found she had to look at the window instead. "I'm not usually like this," she said to the glass. "I don't usually fall apart. I prefer being unnoticed. It's safer. I've never been very good at being in the middle of things." Adriano paused. She could feel him looking at her, and she turned reluctantly and found his eyes, dark, precise, focused on her with an attention she did not know what to do with. "You sat with a discovery that would have made most people pretend they'd never seen it," he said. "You tried to do the right thing through the right channels. You went home and you processed what happened to you, and you still showed up this morning." His thumb moved in a slow, careful arc along the unbruised skin above her clavicle. "You don't disappear, Rue. You just haven't been in a room where anyone was actually paying attention." The moment between them broke on the hard buzz of his encrypted phone. He pulled back, his face resettling into something cooler and more distant, and took the call in 3 words before ending it. He stood. "Lock the door. Cosimo's number is on the counter. Don't open it for anyone else." He was gone for 4 hours. When the private elevator opened again, it was past 11 and the Yorkville streets below had gone quiet. Adriano looked exhausted in a way she hadn't seen before. Collar open, tie gone, and there were dark specks on the white cuff of his shirt that she made a deliberate choice not to examine. He crossed to the kitchen and poured something amber into a glass and stood there for a moment with his eyes closed, and then he came and sat at the other end of the sofa. "Blaine talked," he said. "All of it?" "All of it." He turned the glass in his hands. He wasn't running the siphon for himself. He was a processor, routing the funds on behalf of someone else. The receiving corporation runs through 3 layers before it lands. Switzerland first, then a private equity vehicle in Liechtenstein, then a real estate holding company registered here in Ontario. He looked at her. "That holding company belongs to my cousin, Renato." The name dropped into the quiet room like something falling from a great height. Rue had heard Renato Ferrara's name exactly once, a hallway conversation she hadn't been meant to overhear in a corridor outside a boardroom 2 years ago. She remembered the way the men talking had gone quieter when they realized the door was open. She remembered one of them pulling it closed. "Renato contacted him before Blaine confronted you in the parkade," Adriano continued. "Blaine sent a message the moment you left his office. Renato knows your name. He knows what you found." A pause, measured and heavy. "He's placed a significant price on that information being permanently closed." Rue set her tea down very carefully because her hands had started to shake and she didn't want him to see it. "What does that mean for me?" Adriano leaned forward. The exhaustion in his face had hardened into something steadier, something she could feel the weight of from across the sofa cushions. "It means Renato has made the most serious miscalculation of his life. Because you are under my protection, and he is going to have to come through me to reach you." The next morning, the penthouse became a war room. Cosimo arrived with 2 other men. A tech specialist named Cash set up 3 monitors on the dining room table and spent the better part of the morning trying to reconstruct Renato's financial architecture from encrypted records he'd pulled from Blaine's drives. By noon, he pushed back from the table with a sound of flat, frustrated defeat. "I can break every lock he's put on this," Cash said. "The encryption, the shells, the layered transfers. But the documents themselves, they're legal instruments. Every reference is codified in contract language that points to other contracts I don't have access to. I can see the shape of the structure, but I can't read the map." Adriano looked across the room at Rue. She was standing at the kitchen island with a cup of tea, watching the monitors, and she understood what he was about to say before he said it. "You processed every contract that passed through Ferrara Group's legal department for 3 years," he said slowly. "The Etobicoke file, the 2 before it, every ancillary document attached to each of them." "I remember them," Rue said. The words felt strange in her mouth. She so rarely said it plainly. "All of them, every page." The room went quiet in a very particular way. "Every clause," Cash said. "Every clause, every schedule, every referenced exhibit if it came across my desk." She set her cup down and stood up straighter. "I don't forget things. I've never forgotten anything I've read." Cash looked at Adriano. Adriano looked at Rue. "Sit down," he said simply. For the next 7 hours she did not stop. She stood at the monitors and recited from memory. Contract clauses, routing references, corporation numbers, bank identifiers, date stamps from documents she had processed over a year ago. Cash typed furiously beside her, building a map of Renato's financial web in real time from the architecture she carried in her head. The bruise at her throat had faded to yellow-green at the edges. She'd stopped noticing it. Adriano stood at the back of the room with his arms crossed, and a glass of water he'd forgotten to drink, watching her. He watched the way she closed her eyes to retrieve a specific clause, the small furrow of concentration between her brows when a reference branched, and she had to hold 2 threads at once. He watched the way she came alive with it, her voice growing steadier and more precise as the picture assembled itself on the screen, her posture changing, the uncertain woman from the day before replaced by someone who knew exactly what she was doing and why it mattered. She was extraordinary. Once you were actually paying attention, it was one of the clearest things he had ever seen. "There," Rue said, just past midnight. Everyone in the room moved at once. The final routing sequence. She traced it on the screen with one finger. Renato's holding company doesn't just receive the siphoned funds. It holds silent security interests in 4 separate development sites across the GTA, sites that Ferrara Group is publicly credited with building, but where Renato has a claim that predates every contract I processed. If you hand this sequence to the RCMP's Financial Crimes Unit, they can freeze his legitimate assets within 48 hours. Every property title, every business account, everything he's spent a decade building inside the law. Cosimo exhaled a long, low breath. She just found the off switch to his entire operation. Adriano was already moving toward her when the lights went out. Not a power cut, a cut. One moment the monitors were on, and the next they were dark, the ventilation silent, the particular dead silence of a building whose electricity has been deliberately killed. Cash swore in the dark, and then the emergency breach alarm screamed through the penthouse, and Cosimo was already moving, already shouting, "He found us! Move! Move!" And the reinforced door of the private elevator blew off its tracks with a detonation that knocked a painting from the wall and left Rue's ears ringing. Men with tactical lights poured through the smoke. Cosimo grabbed her arm and pulled her into the hallway, moving hard toward the back of the penthouse. She could hear Adriano behind them, not shouting orders but issuing them in a low, precise voice she felt in her sternum, and then the compressed sound of weapons, and shattering glass, and the specific horror of violence in a room full of beautiful things. The panic room was behind a bookcase in the master suite. Cosimo punched in the manual override code with one eye on the corridor, and Rue was right behind him, bare feet on hardwood, heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth, when a figure stepped out of the darkened guest room to their right. He was built broad and dressed in dark gear, and he raised his weapon directly at Cosimo's back. Rue didn't think. Thinking was the thing that made you freeze, and she had spent enough of her life frozen in one form or another. She threw herself sideways into the man with everything she had, all of her weight, every ounce of momentum she could generate in 3 running steps, and the impact knocked him hard enough to the left that his burst of fire went into the ceiling instead of into Cosimo's spine. The man's elbow connected with the side of her face on the rebound, a vicious, back-handed swing that sent her into the floor, and her head hit the hardwood, and the world went white, and then very grey at the edges, and she heard a single gunshot, and then her name. Rue. Adriano was there. She heard him running before she could see him in the dark, the sound of him coming fast, which she had not until that moment imagined hearing, and then he was on his knees on the floor beside her, with both hands on her face, tilting it, checking, and his hands were not steady. "I'm all right," she managed. Her lip was split, she could taste copper. I have a very hard head." He made a sound she didn't have a name for. He gathered her up off the floor, her full weight in his arms, and held her for a long moment against his chest, without saying anything at all. "Building's clear," Cosimo said from the doorway, 3 minutes before the police arrive. The evacuation was fast and quiet. A service stairwell, a lower garage, a second fleet of vehicles waiting in the dark. 40 minutes later they were in an industrial space in East Harbor, the lake visible through high warehouse windows, the city a diffuse amber glow across the black water. Adriano carried her into a back room and set her gently on the edge of a folding cot. Someone produced a first aid kit. He cleaned the blood from her split lip with a steadiness that was different from before, slower, or perhaps she was just paying different attention. The warehouse was cold and smelled of concrete and salt air, and she was shivering in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Why did you do that?" he said. She looked at him. He was crouched in front of her, jacket long gone, his shirt dark at the collar. He looked like someone who'd had something very close happen and was still recalibrating around it. "Because you were protecting me," Rue said. "And I've spent my whole life being the person no one bothers to protect, because they look at me and they decide I'm not worth the trouble. The quiet girl in the corner desk who processes contracts no one reads, who's easy to overlook because she makes herself easy to overlook." She stopped. "You looked at me like what was in my head actually mattered, like I was someone worth standing in front of." A pause, small and honest. "I wasn't going to let someone take that from you." He looked at her for a long moment. Then his hands came up and cupped her face. "Carefully, the way you hold something you haven't finished understanding," and his thumbs traced a gentle arc beneath her eyes. "You are not a paralegal," he said very quietly. "You are the most dangerous thing that has ever walked through my building, and you have been wasted every single day in that corner desk." His voice dropped lower. "That ends now. You are mine to protect, Rue, and mine to fight beside. Both things. Neither one cancels the other." He kissed her. Not softly. There was nothing soft in either of them in that moment, but carefully, precisely, one hand sliding to the back of her neck and holding her like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She kissed him back with everything the past 48 hours had built up in her, all of it. The fear and the grief of being invisible for so long, and the strange, terrifying, bone-deep warmth of being finally, completely seen. When he pulled back, his forehead came to rest against hers, and they were both breathing hard, and the warehouse held only the sound of the lake and the low hum of the city across the water. "Tomorrow morning," Adriano said, "I take the routing sequence to my contact at the RCMP Financial Crimes Division. One phone call and Renato's assets are frozen inside 48 hours. A pause. Every property, every account, everything he built inside the law while stealing from the people around him. And then." His expression went very still and very certain. "And then Renato Ferrara discovers that the woman he put a price on is the sharpest thing in my entire arsenal." The corner of his mouth moved. "He burned down my home tonight because he thought you were a loose end. He has no idea what you actually are." Outside the warehouse windows, the October lake was flat and black and cold, and Toronto glittered across it like a city that did not yet know anything had changed. Inside, Rue Sinclair, who had spent 3 years making herself invisible, who had memorized 3 years' worth of contracts no one else had thought to read, who had thrown herself between a bullet and a man who had stood in front of her first, pulled a heavy wool blanket around her shoulders and leaned into the warmth of the person beside her. She was no longer the quiet girl in the corner desk. She was the woman who remembered everything. And somewhere across the city, in a building that still had his family name above the lobby doors, Renato Ferrara did not yet know that the war he had started had just found its weapon. If this story had your heart in your throat, hit the like button and share it with someone who loves a good dark romance. Subscribe to Blind Curves so you never miss what's coming next, and drop a comment below. Do you think Renato makes his next move against Rue directly, or does he go after Adriano first? The next chapter is close, and nothing about it is going to be safe.